The altered seating plan was not an impulsive insult. According to those inside the palace, Camilla had spent weeks reshaping the invisible hierarchy around her, testing which relatives would obey and which would resist. Meghan's place at the table became the final and most dangerous test of that authority. Long before the guests arrived, quiet discussions had already begun behind palace doors. They were not described as punishments, and no one openly used the language of revenge. Instead, the conversations focused on order, dignity, and the need for royal gatherings to reflect what courtiers called the new reality. Camilla's influence was growing, and those closest to her believed that influence had to be visible. Not through speeches, not through announcements, through smaller details that could be defended as tradition. Who entered first mattered. Who waited mattered. Who received a private invitation mattered. And above all, where someone sat could reveal exactly how much power they still possessed. Certain advisors argued that the monarchy had become too relaxed about these signals. Harry and Meghan were no longer working royals, yet whenever they appeared near the center of the family, the public still treated them as major figures. Their presence generated headlines. Their expressions were studied. Their smallest interactions could overshadow the people who had remained inside the institution. To Camilla, that was becoming impossible to ignore. Meghan's continued visibility near senior members of the family allegedly represented a contradiction. She had stepped away from royal duty, but she could still appear beside those carrying the burden of the crown. She could remain emotionally connected to the family without submitting to its discipline. That made her difficult to control, and more importantly, difficult to place. The official argument was simple. The seating plan needed to respect hierarchy. But privately, the change carried a sharper message. Meghan would no longer decide how close she stood to royal power. The palace would decide for her. Some advisors warned that moving her too obviously could provoke Harry. They understood his history. They knew he had spent years watching small acts of exclusion presented as harmless protocol. Separating him from Meghan during a tense family gathering would not feel neutral. It would leave her exposed and prevent them from quietly supporting each other when difficult conversations began. Camilla reportedly believed Harry would still remain silent. With Charles present, William nearby, and senior guests watching, she expected him to protect the dignity of the occasion rather than challenge the arrangement. Charles was told that minor adjustments might be required, but he was never shown the final plan. That distance protected him from responsibility while giving Camilla's team space to act. William heard rumors that the order had been revised, yet he refused to interfere. Another clash with Harry, he feared, could deepen a crisis the family had never truly repaired. And so Meghan became more than a guest. She became the symbol of everything the palace could not resolve. Distance without disappearance, rejection without irrelevance, and a woman outside the monarchy who could still change the emotional balance of the room. Camilla believed the revised arrangement would quietly establish control. But she had underestimated the one thing: Harry could no longer tolerate the use of royal protocol to isolate his wife while everyone pretended nothing had happened. Harry did not raise his voice when he first saw the name card. He simply stood still, staring at the distance between his chair and Meghan's. Those watching expected frustration. What they saw instead was something more dangerous: the expression of a man who believed an old promise had been broken. Only hours earlier, Harry had been shown an arrangement that placed Meghan beside him, close enough to the central royal group that neither of them would appear isolated. It was one of the reasons he had agreed to attend. Yet when he entered ahead of her, the plan had changed. His chair remained near Charles, William, and the senior members of the family. Meghan's name had been moved much farther away, into a position that made the separation impossible to explain as an accident. For several seconds, Harry said nothing. He studied the table, then looked toward the staff standing nearby. They already appeared uneasy. One aide stepped forward and offered the sort of explanation the palace had perfected over generations. The adjustment, he said, was about balance, seniority, guest requirements. Words that sounded official but revealed almost nothing. Harry asked a simpler question. Had Camilla ordered it? The aide did not answer immediately. That pause was enough. No name needed to be spoken. Harry understood exactly where the instruction had come from and why no one wanted to admit it directly. Before accepting the invitation, he had asked for only one condition. He and Meghan would not be brought back into a royal gathering merely to become symbols of division. They would not be separated for effect, placed in positions designed to invite speculation, or used to demonstrate who remained inside the institution and who had been pushed beyond its protection. The altered seat broke that understanding before the evening had even begun. To others, it may have looked like a minor change. To Harry, it carried the weight of every earlier moment when Meghan had been expected to accept exclusion quietly. She had been told to remain calm for the sake of the family, to ignore the message behind the gesture, and to protect senior royals from the consequences of decisions made against her. Silence had always been presented as dignity, but Harry had begun to see it as surrender. Still, he did not go directly to Camilla. Not yet. He turned to the aides and demanded that Meghan's original place be restored before she entered. The instruction placed the staff in an impossible position. Obeying Harry meant reversing a decision linked to Camilla. Refusing meant allowing a private dispute to become visible the moment Meghan saw the table. Minutes began slipping away. Guests were waiting. The arrival order was starting to break down, and senior courtiers realized that the longer the disagreement continued, the harder it would be to contain. What had been designed as a quiet display of control was now threatening to expose the machinery behind it. The staff hoped a quiet compromise could still save the evening, but Meghan entered before the place card was restored, and the look on her face forced Harry to decide whether he would protect the event or protect her. Meghan did not need an aide to explain what the new seat meant. She recognized the language instantly, the careful distance, the polite smiles, the humiliation disguised as tradition. Yet instead of protesting, she prepared to sit down, and that quiet acceptance affected Harry more deeply than open anger could have. The moment she entered, Meghan saw the gap between them. Her name was no longer beside Harry's. It had been moved far enough away to send a message, yet carefully enough for the palace to deny that any message existed. Around her, conversations continued with forced ease. Senior members of the family avoided her eyes, as though not acknowledging the change might make it harmless. But Meghan understood how these moments worked. An open refusal would not be remembered as resistance. It would be described as another disruption. A raised voice could become proof that she lacked respect for tradition. Even a visible expression of hurt could be turned into a headline about her inability to follow royal protocol. The insult had been designed with that trap in mind. She could accept it and suffer quietly, or object and become the problem. Harry moved toward her, already prepared to explain, but Meghan spoke first. Quietly, she told him they should not create a scene. They would sit down, get through the evening, and refuse to give anyone the reaction they might be waiting for. That answer did not calm him. It made everything worse. Her composure revealed that she had expected this possibility. Somewhere before entering the room, Meghan had already prepared herself to be excluded, judged, or placed at a distance. She was not shocked because the pattern was familiar. And Harry suddenly understood that what looked like strength was also exhaustion. Across the room, Camilla remained composed. She continued speaking with guests as though nothing unusual had happened. Her calm created its own pressure. Everyone was expected to behave as if the arrangement were natural, and by doing so, they would help transform a deliberate act into accepted tradition. Charles appeared less certain. When he noticed how far Meghan had been placed from Harry, his expression changed. He had been told that adjustments might be necessary, but the severity of the separation seemed to catch him off guard. Still, he said nothing. Harry looked from Charles to William, then toward the courtiers surrounding them. Was their silence obedience to Camilla? Agreement with her decision? Or were they simply willing to let Meghan absorb the humiliation because challenging it would disturb the evening? Meghan warned him that a public confrontation could overshadow everything. The palace would say they had brought tension into the room. Once again, the decision made against her would disappear beneath the reaction it caused. Harry hesitated. Respecting her request meant allowing the insult to stand. Defending her meant risking the very narrative she feared. But he could no longer accept a system that demanded Meghan surrender her dignity so everyone else could remain comfortable. Before the dinner formally began, he turned away from his assigned place and moved directly toward Camilla. Meghan had chosen silence to protect them both. But Harry could no longer accept a peace built on her humiliation, and when he approached Camilla, the entire balance of the room began to shift. The room had not yet fallen silent, but the people closest to Camilla noticed Harry approaching. There was no shouting, no dramatic gesture, only a direct question that cut through every layer of royal politeness. Why had Meghan been moved after the arrangement was already agreed? Harry kept his voice controlled, but the tension beneath it was impossible to miss. He stood close enough for Camilla to hear every word clearly, yet not so close that the exchange could be dismissed as private. Charles, William, and several nearby guests understood immediately what was happening. The disagreement the staff had tried to contain was now moving into the center of the evening. Camilla answered with calm precision. The change, she said, had been required by protocol. The final seating plan needed to reflect seniority, responsibility, and the proper balance of the gathering. No insult had been intended, and no personal meaning should be attached to a simple adjustment. But Harry had heard that language before. He pointed out that protocol had not suddenly changed in the few hours since the original plan had been approved. Meghan had been seated beside him earlier. No new title had been granted, no guest had unexpectedly arrived. No ceremonial rule had appeared without warning. The only thing that had changed was someone's decision. Then Harry asked the question Camilla could not easily avoid. Why had Meghan been separated from him when other couples with far less ceremonial importance had been allowed to remain together? For the first time, Camilla's answer moved beyond vague language. Meghan, she suggested, could not step away from royal duty and still expect every privilege given to senior working members of the family. Her place had to reflect the position she had chosen. There it was, the true argument beneath the chair. Harry responded that the invitation had been extended to both of them. They had returned as a couple, not as separate symbols to be placed according to palace convenience. Meghan should not be welcomed through the doors only to be visibly reduced once she entered the room. Charles attempted to interrupt. He suggested that the conversation continue elsewhere, away from waiting guests. But Harry refused. The decision had already been made publicly, he argued, because everyone could see where Meghan had been placed. Moving the discussion behind closed doors would only hide the responsibility, not repair the damage. Camilla warned him that confronting her in this way threatened the dignity of the crown. Harry's response was immediate. Royal dignity, he said, could not depend on Meghan quietly accepting humiliation. William remained silent, watching the argument tighten around the family. He knew that stepping forward might calm Harry, but it could just as easily reopen every unresolved wound between the brothers. At a distance, Meghan watched with divided emotions. Part of her wanted to stop Harry before the evening collapsed. Another part recognized what his refusal meant. Inside these walls, she had rarely been defended without first being asked to endure. Then, Harry delivered the line that removed every possibility of retreat. He would not take his assigned seat unless Meghan was returned to hers. Harry's refusal transformed a private insult into a direct challenge to royal authority. But Camilla's response made it clear that the seat was connected to something far larger than dinner etiquette. Camilla could have ended the confrontation by restoring one-place card. Instead, she defended the decision with unusual determination. That refusal exposed the deeper struggle beneath the evening, who had the right to define royal belonging, and whether Harry still possessed enough influence to challenge the new order. To Camilla, reversing the change would mean far more than moving Meghan back beside her husband. It would show that Harry, despite stepping away from royal duty, could still enter the palace, challenge a decision, and force the structure around him to bend. That possibility threatened the authority she had spent years building. If she gave way now, every future instruction could be questioned by anyone willing to create enough emotional pressure. The argument was no longer about courtesy. It had become a test of power. Was royal hierarchy controlled by rank written into the institution, by the private influence of those closest to the crown, or by the emotional bonds that still connected a father to his son? Camilla believed Meghan's position had to reflect her distance from official service. Harry believed family dignity should not disappear when public duty ended. Neither side was speaking only about that evening. There was another motive hidden beneath the revised arrangement. The dinner could establish a pattern for every future ceremony, memorial, celebration, or private gathering Meghan might attend. Once she accepted a place far from the center, the palace could repeat it later and call it established protocol. What began as one seat would become a permanent rule without ever being formally announced. Senior courtiers understood the wider danger. Keeping Meghan close to the central royal group might renew questions the palace wanted contained. Questions about titles, access, inheritance, the position of Harry's children, and whether leaving royal service had truly removed the family's influence over public attention. The chair carried all of that weight. Harry slowly realized the dinner may have been designed to create a visible example. There would be no official punishment, no written demotion, and no public statement. Meghan would simply be placed farther away, and the family's silence would make that distance appear normal. Charles recognized that the dispute was moving beyond control. He quietly urged Camilla to reconsider, not because he fully rejected her reasoning, but because he feared Harry might leave before the evening began. Another departure would create headlines, deepen the family divide, and turn a private struggle into a public disaster. Camilla resisted. Backing down, she believed, would weaken her position and prove that royal structure could be defeated by confrontation. Meghan then urged Harry not to risk what remained of his relationship with Charles over one dinner. But Harry answered that the danger was never one dinner. It was the repeated use of small gestures to enforce a much larger rejection. And beneath his anger, he was holding something Camilla did not yet know. The memory of an earlier agreement that could destroy the logic behind her decision. Camilla believed hierarchy gave her the final word, but Harry was about to reveal that the seating arrangement violated a private promise made before they ever agreed to return. Harry turned away from Camilla and addressed his father directly. Months earlier, Charles had allegedly promised that Meghan would never be invited back merely to be diminished in public. Now, surrounded by silent guests and anxious courtiers, Harry demanded to know whether that promise had ever meant anything. Before Harry and Meghan had agreed to attend, father and son had spoken privately about the risks of returning. Harry had been clear. Meghan would not enter the palace only to become part of another carefully managed display of distance. There would be no staged humiliation, no deliberate separation, and no symbolic punishment hidden behind ceremonial details. Charles had allegedly given him his word. That promise had helped bring them back. It was not written into any official document, but Harry believed it carried the weight of something more important: a father's assurance that family would not be sacrificed for appearances again. Now, with Meghan's name placed far from his own, Harry repeated the substance of that conversation in front of Camilla. He did not reveal every private word, but he revealed enough. Charles had known the condition. He had accepted it. And the revised seating plan stood in direct conflict with the understanding that had made their attendance possible. Charles tried to defend the situation by separating personal respect from formal protocol. He insisted that Meghan was still valued as a member of the family, even if her place had to reflect her position outside royal duty. But the argument immediately weakened. Meghan's original seat had already been approved. If protocol truly required distance, why had no one noticed the problem until the final hours? The change was not an old rule being followed. It was a new decision being forced into the language of tradition. Camilla's frustration became harder to conceal. A private promise between Charles and Harry was now being used to overturn a decision made under her influence. To her, this was no longer a family misunderstanding. It was an attempt to weaken her authority in front of the very people expected to respect it. Harry pressed harder. He accused the palace of hiding emotional punishment behind technical words so that no individual ever had to accept responsibility. Every insult became an adjustment. Every rejection became protocol. Every wound was treated as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Then, William finally spoke. Without directly criticizing Camilla, he suggested that the original arrangement should be restored before the damage became impossible to contain. His intervention shocked those nearby. For once, he was not asking Harry to remain calm. He was indirectly admitting that Harry's complaint had merit. Meghan understood what had changed. The family could no longer pretend the seat was neutral. Everyone knew what it represented. Charles now faced a brutal choice: defend Camilla's authority or honor the promise made to his son. Either decision would leave resentment behind. After a long pause, he quietly instructed the staff to restore Meghan's original place. Harry had won the immediate battle, but no one mistook it for peace. The place card was returned, yet nobody believed the conflict had ended. Because Camilla's authority had been challenged, Charles's promise had been exposed, and Harry had made silence impossible. Meghan finally sat beside Harry exactly where she had originally been placed. To the guests, the crisis appeared resolved. But beneath the polished conversation, a deeper rupture had opened, one that transformed a single chair into evidence of betrayal, resistance, and a monarchy struggling to control its own family. The dinner began after a delay no one dared explain. Guests took their places and behaved as though nothing unusual had happened, even though many had watched the arrangement change twice. First, Meghan had been moved. Then, she had been restored. The table now looked orderly, but the silence around it carried the weight of everything that had nearly broken apart. Meghan remained composed. She gave no visible anger, no sharp remark, and no reaction that could later be shaped into proof of disrespect. If some courtiers had expected emotion, she denied them the satisfaction. Yet her calm did not mean the insult had disappeared. It meant she had chosen not to let the room control how she responded. Harry could not relax so easily. He stayed alert, watching every pause and carefully measured exchange. Meghan was beside him again, but the intention behind moving her remained. A restored place card could correct the table. It could not erase the message. Camilla became colder and more formal. Her authority had been challenged in front of family, staff, and guests, and Harry had proved that her decisions involving Meghan would no longer pass without resistance. She had not simply lost control of one seat, she had discovered the limit of her influence. Charles tried to revive ordinary conversation, but the effort only exposed how little power he held over the emotional war between his wife and son. He could restore the arrangement, but he could not restore trust. William's intervention created its own unanswered question. Had he defended Harry, protected the monarchy, or merely stopped the evening from collapsing? Before the meal was even over, palace aides were already preparing explanations in case the confrontation reached the press. One version described a harmless misunderstanding. Another blamed a last-minute adjustment. Image management had begun before family repair was even considered. Meghan quietly told Harry that his defense had mattered. Still, she feared the confrontation would be used against them. The palace could now claim they had created tension and use that claim to justify keeping them farther away in the future. Harry answered that silence would have been more dangerous. Accepting the seat would have created a precedent, allowing every future humiliation to be defended as tradition. They left with a symbolic victory and a painful understanding. Private promises meant little unless they were prepared to defend them publicly. What remained uncertain was whether Camilla's failed attempt had strengthened Harry's position or convinced the palace that Meghan must never again be allowed close enough to challenge the center. The evening had been designed to display unity. Instead, it revealed a brutal truth. Inside the monarchy, even a chair can become a weapon, and silence can become surrender. The palace succeeded in keeping the dinner from collapsing, but it could not erase what the room had witnessed. Harry had chosen Meghan over royal obedience, and Camilla would not forget who had forced her to retreat.